I think I'm ready for a blouse Stella pattern hack. And you know what? This hack comes totally for free and perhaps you can learn something about pattern construction. So, hi everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm from Koba.Siani. I'm glad to have you here again. And yes, this is really a pattern hack of the Stella blouse. So all that you need for this dress here is the blouse pattern Stella that you can purchase in my Etsy, Afrika and Ribbler shop. And the rest comes for free, as I've said. There is one component that you should download from my homepage in the freebie section, and that is the pocket bags here. As you can see, the dress has pockets. And for the rest, I'm showing you here in the video how to change the pattern and how to draft the pattern pieces that you will need additionally. As you can see, the changes are that here the Stella has long sleeves with a cuff and buttons, and we have a skirt part with the side seam pockets, and we changed the V-neck to a small round neck. The written sewing instruction for this dress here you can also download in my freebie section on my homepage Koba.Siani.com. As well, remember well, the pocket bags. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you won't miss any new pattern hacks or freebies here. So if you are ready to play around a little bit with the Stella blouse pattern, get yourself a download in one of my shops and let's start sewing. Have fun!
Okay, at first we have to do the pattern alterations. I'm using pins to fix my original pattern on a new piece of paper. There, by the way, you can also use an old newspaper to make your new pattern. And I'm using a good ruler, a pencil and paper scissors, of course. Then I can trace the original pattern or change it according to the design. As it's quite hard in this picture here to see what I'm doing, I'm showing you everything on a smaller scale. So let's start. At first I'm folding away the lower part of the pattern because we don't need the part below the waistline. Then I'm beginning with the back part. As we'll make a zipper in the center back of the dress, I'm adding here now 1 cm for the seam allowance. I'm adding also 1 cm seam allowance at the waistline for our waist seam later. And the rest of the shape I'm tracing now first. I'm also transferring all the notches in the armhole and for the darts. Now one more change for the back. We have to lift the waistline 1 cm at the side seam. From the original seam point at the side seam, which is 1 cm within the pattern, I'm measuring 1 cm upwards and then linking this new point with the left side of the dart. Then I'm cutting the whole pattern. For the front panel, I'm fixing the original pattern exactly at one straight edge and then tracing all the notches and outlines of the pattern. At the waistline, I'm doing the same as for the back panel. I'm lifting the waistline 1 cm at the side seam, so I'm linking the right side of the dart with this new point and then adding there at the waistline 1 cm seam allowance. Then I'm continuing with the neckline. Here also I need the original seam line crossing point, which is 1 cm within the pattern. From this point I'm drawing a line now, which should be in a 90-degree angle to the extended center front line. Then I'm measuring this distance from the center front to the seam point at the shoulder. My new neck drop is now this distance plus 1 cm. And this I'm now measuring downwards at the center front from the artificial line. Okay, so now I can draw in the new neckline curve. That means this is the seam line now. And for this curve, it's important that you draw a tiny little bit at the center front in a 90-degree angle so that the curve is later smooth there in this area. Afterwards, I'm adding back the seam allowance of 1 centimeter. Then the front panel is done and I can cut it now. Of course, we need now a new neckline facing. So at first I'm drawing a parallel line along the neckline in the width of the facing. The facing width is different for each size. For my size it's 6 centimeter. And how I'm copying this, I'm showing you now in real life size. First, I'm pinning the neckline area of my pattern to a blank paper, and then I'm cutting and copying the outlines at the shoulder and neckline and center front of my pattern. To trace the lower edge of the facing onto the new paper, I'm copying this line at the window, which is a natural light box. Afterwards, I'm cutting the new facing and I'm adding all the necessary lettering so that I won't confuse my patterns later. Then we are moving on to the sleeves, and I'm measuring my sleeve length from the shoulder to the wrist above a slightly bent elbow. For the new sleeves, I'm at first determining the cuff dimensions. For my dress here, I'm choosing a ready cuff height of 9 cm, and the width of the cuff depends on your wrist width, of course. For the buttons later, we have to add another 1.5 cm for the overlapping there. And then, of course, we need 1 cm seam allowance all around the edges. Then I'm just quickly measuring the current sleeve length without the seam allowance on the sleeve head. Means I'm starting to measure 1 cm below the edge. Then I can subtract the current sleeve length from my desired measured arm length. In a normal case, I would have to subtract also the half of the cuff height and add afterwards 1 cm seam allowance. But because of the extra length and puffiness I want to have for my sleeve, I'll just leave it like this. For the sleeve, I'm not making an extra pattern, I'm just cutting it longer later. Then I'm moving on to the skirt. For the skirt length, 45 cm is quite a good measurement for an average body height if you want to have a skirt which is not too long and not too short. For the skirt width, I'm looking at my hip width and then thinking about how wide I want the skirt to be. For the following calculations, we'll need the half of this measurement. The skirt parts will be simple rectangles, and here I'm drawing the front skirt. For the upper edge and the side seams, we need 1 cm seam allowance, and for the hem, I'm making 1 + 2 cm seam allowance. Then I'm calculating the piece which I have to cut with the ready length of 45 cm and a half skirt width of 62 cm. I'm adding now all the planned seam allowances and I get 48 cm in height and 64 cm in width. So this is my front piece. The back skirt is divided into two because of the zipper in the center back. There I'm doing a similar calculation. The height of the pattern piece is the same, of course, and the width is 33 centimeters. Finally, we can cut the fabric. So this is how I would cut it normally, but I have another idea for the stripe directions, so I'll make it a little bit differently. I'll make vertical stripes for the top and the sleeves and horizontal stripes for the skirt part. Okay, now so first come the top parts, front and back. And then the facings for the neckline, front and back. The cuffs we need 4 times. And here I'm cutting the sleeves. At the lower edge I'm adding the length I've calculated before. As we will need a sleeve slit later for the cuff, I'm cutting into the sleeves between the sleeve center and the right border of the sleeve. And the slit height is about 8 cm. Here I'm cutting the pocket bags. These also we need 4 times. As already mentioned, you can download the pattern for the pocket bags for free on my homepage. The link is below this video here. And afterwards I'm cutting the skirt parts. I'm beginning with a long stripe over the width of the fabric in the length of the skirt, and then I'm cutting the single pieces according to my calculations. At the side seams we will need notches for the pocket bags. So I'm measuring a bit downwards from the waistline and then transferring the notches from the pocket bag pattern onto the skirt pattern. For the sleeve slits and also for the zipper we will need later some bias cut tape, so this I'm doing here. I'm cutting in a width of 2.5 cm. The neckline facings and the outer layer of the cuffs I'm also cutting in a soft interlining. And here I'm already fixing the interlining with my iron. At the sewing machine, at first I'm closing all the darts, means the darts in the shoulders, waistline and the chest darts. Then I'm closing the waist seam. For this I have to gather the skirt part. If you want to see my technique a little bit more detailed, please click the link here in the video. Here I'm beginning with the sleeve slits. I'm taking one of the bias tapes and putting its right side on the left fabric side of the sleeve. I'm just fixing the starting point of my seam later with a pin. Then I'm sewing on the bias tape. I'm sewing with a seam allowance of about 7 mm. That means that's the half of the width of my sewing foot. I'm sewing up to 1 cm above the slit end and I'm pulling the seam a little bit towards the middle. Then I'm stopping my seam. The needle should be in a downwards position in the fabric and I'm lifting my sewing foot. Then I'm cutting into the sleeve layer up to 1 to 2 mm before the needle. And afterwards I can turn the fabric around and then continue with the second side of the slit. This I have to repeat with the second sleeve, of course. And we have to do some casting work. At first I'm casting the waist seam allowance and then afterwards the side seams on the dress and the pocket bags, the center back, all shoulders and at the facings, the center back also, shoulders and the lower edge. When you cast the side seams and the center back, please make sure that the seam allowance of the waist seam points upwards and the chest darts point downwards. Before we'll continue to sew, we will iron a little bit. We are ironing the waist seam upwards all the darts to the center, front and back, or downwards for the chest dart. And we are preparing the sleeve slit. This I will show you a little bit more detailed. At first I'm ironing the seam flat, and then I'm folding the bias tape towards the front. Now, by the way, the right fabric side of the sleeve is showing upwards. I'm folding the bias tape twice for about 7 mm towards the upper side, so that the edge of the slit is now wrapped with this bias tape. I'm ironing the folded bias tape and then fixing it with pins. As a next step, we will fix the pocket bags along the side seam to the dress. There, at first we have to align the notches which are there, and later we will also sew only from notch to notch. That means that 1 cm at the top and the bottom of the pocket bag will hang loose later. Now this is the seam what I'm doing now here, and I'm sewing with a seam allowance of 1 cm as always. Then I'm stitching on the bias tape at the sleeve slit. To make the slit lay nicer, we're just adding a short sloped stitching here at the top of the slit. This stitching is only on the bias tape binding. And we are continuing with the sleeves. Now I'm closing the sleeve seam, and afterwards I'm also casting the seam allowance. Then I'm sewing the cuff layers together, so one side with interlining, one side without, right fabric side to right fabric side, and I'm sewing along the vertical and the lower edge, but I'm starting and I'm stopping the seam 1 cm from the upper edge. Afterwards, I'm trimming the seam allowance down to 5 mm and at the corners down to 1 to 2 mm. Then I'm continuing with the zipper. At first, I'm sewing it to the back neck facing. I'm putting it on the facing like this with a zipper puller showing upwards, as well as the right fabric side of the facing. The edges at the right side align, and the zipper start is 1 cm below the upper edge of the facing. For this short seam, I'm using the zipper sewing foot, and I've changed the needle position to totally at the left. And I'm sewing now with a distance from the edge of 7 to 8 mm. When this is done, I can sew in the zipper to the back panels and also close the center back. Afterwards, I'm also adding a bias tape binding along the zipper edges. But as this is exactly the same workmanship as for the side seam zipper in the basic Stella blouse, I'm linking you the video to the video tutorial here, and I will go on with the next steps. And this next step is to close the shoulder seams in the main fabric and in the facings. Right fabric side to right fabric side, of course, and I'm sewing with a seam allowance of 1 cm. Now let's move to the iron. At first I'm ironing the shoulder seam allowances apart. The same I'm doing at the side seam at the pocket bags. I'm ironing flat the sleeve seam and ironing the seam allowance to the back. And then, with the help of a wooden spoon, I'm ironing apart the seam allowances of the cuff. And then I'm turning around the cuff to the right fabric side and ironing it flat. Here I'm preparing the neckline seam. At first I'm fixing the facings with pins to the main layer. The right fabric sides point now to each other, and I'm taking care that the shoulder seams of the facings and the main layer align. The seam allowance is as always 1 cm. Afterwards, I'll close the side seams. There again the notches are very important. Each seam is from the pocket bag notch to the upper or lower edge. I'd like to work very precisely in the pocket area, so I'm starting each seam at the pocket bag notch. And then I'm sewing upwards to the armhole or downwards to the hem edge. Then we can close the pocket bags. After cutting off all the thread ends, I'm fixing them with pins. And as you can see, I'm keeping the folds at the side seam of the pocket. Again, 1 cm seam allowance, I'm sewing all around the pocket edges. Now we will link the cuffs to the sleeves. At the sleeve slits, I'm folding the side of the slit which is towards the sleeve center to the inside, only in the width of the bias tape binding. This side will be our overlay at the cuff later. Then I'm gathering the sleeve to fit the cuff width. The next step, fixing the cuff to the sleeve, I'm showing you on a sleeve mock-up. As you can see, there is no real sleeve because I've changed the workmanship after finishing the dress. And I'm fixing the inner layer of the cuff, that means the layer without the interlining, to the wrong fabric side of the sleeve. Again, some gathering, and I'm trying to distribute the extra width equally along the cuff. To show it to you here again, here is the inside of the sleeve and we're sewing it to the inner layer of the cuff. The seam allowance is 1 cm as always. Now I'm gathering the sleeve head and then fixing the sleeve into the armhole with pins. Of course, I have to take care that the notches align. When I'm sewing in a sleeve, I'm always sewing on the sleeve layer because that makes it easier to distribute the extra width in the sleeve. Now it's time to cast the armholes and the pocket bags. I'm threading in all the loose seam ends into the overlock seam. Here you can again see my sleeve and cuff mock-up. I'm ironing here the seam allowance of the cuff seam towards the cuff, and the loose edge of the cuff I'm ironing 1 cm towards the wrong fabric side, and then I can fix and close the cuff with pins first. Then I'm ironing the side seam allowances apart, and I'm already starting with the hem too. I'm folding and ironing and afterwards fixing the hem with pins. And that's first 1 cm and then 2 cm towards the wrong fabric side as already calculated. Then I'm starting with a neckline. At first I'm trimming the seam allowance down to 5 mm. Then I'm cutting into the seam allowance along the roundings. And then, again with the help of a wooden spoon, I'm ironing the seam allowance apart. Then I can fold the facing to the inside of the dress and iron the neckline edge. I'm also already fixing the shoulder seams of the facing and outer layer on top of each other with pins. Afterwards I'm ironing the armhole seam and I'm taking care that I don't iron flat all the beautiful ruffles. At last I'm ironing the pocket bags towards the center front from the right fabric side of the dress. So we are really getting close to the end now. Here I'm stitching the cuff, which I've prepared before with the iron. I'm only stitching the seam which closes the cuff, but you can also stitch all around the cuff edges. Then comes the hem stitching. And now we are going to place some bar tacks, so I'm reducing the stitch length now a little bit. The first bar tack is in the shoulder seam. I'm stitching from the right fabric side, and this bar tack holds the facing layer and the outer layer together. I'm just stitching forth and back for a few stitches. Then we are securing the pockets with some bar tacks. I make sure that the pocket bags still point to the center front. And again, I'm making some stitches forth and back at the ends of the pockets. just quickly controlling that everything went well also for the inside. And then we can start with the buttonholes. I've chosen 4 small buttons for my cuff. The buttonhole beginnings should be 7 mm away from the cuff edge. Here I'm sewing the buttonhole. Please follow the description of your sewing machine here. So these are really the last things to do. I'm opening the buttonholes with my seam ripper and I'm sewing on the buttons by hand.
I hope you've enjoyed this video and that everything went well, of course. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me and write me an email, for example, to info@Koba.Siani.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel here, of course, and leave me a thumbs up here on YouTube. And if you like to, follow me on social media, on Instagram, Facebook or Pinterest for more creative content. I'd be happy to see you here again very soon in my next video. Take care until then, and bye!